Okay, so good afternoon and welcome to your Construction Safety Association of Manitoba's 2023 virtual webinar series. My name is Megan Story and I am the Training and Development Manager of the Construction Safety Association of Manitoba. We are proud to be recognized as your premier and trusted source for safety and health information, resources, training, and core certification. Today's virtual webinar is an example of how we are striving to provide you with practical and relevant information to help with accident prevention in your workplace. For those of you who know CSAM, quite simply our answer is yes. How can we help? We will have the answers to your safety questions, or we will find the answer with the help of our qualified resources and partners in safety and health. Today, I am pleased to introduce Edwin Wooster, who will provide us with some of the necessary steps that should be considered during the pre-construction planning and when performing a demo assessment. This session will cover asbestos and other hazardous building materials that may have a significant impact on your construction project. The session will cover different types of assessments, understanding the assessment reports, regulatory requirements, and how to safely plan the removal. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and a copy of Edwin's presentation will be made available following today's webinar. We will also be taking questions and answers at the end of the session today, so please feel free to add those questions into the chat at any time, and Edwin will respond to those either during the session or at the end of the session. Without further ado, Edwin, the screen is all yours.
Thank you. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. As Megan introduced me, my name's Ed Wooster. I am the technical manager and the regional practice leader for hazardous materials over at Pinchin Limited. I've been with Pinchin for 33 years, so I've got a little bit of experience under my belt here. Today, as Megan mentioned, we're going to be talking about asbestos inventories and project planning. We're going to expand into other hazardous materials as well, because that is a requirement once we start getting into the renovations and demolition work. So, workplace safety and health. Canadian workplaces and regulators have traditionally placed their main focus on safety when we look at enforcement in the workplace. From a historical standpoint, 33 years ago, when I started with Pinchin, occupational disease was almost unheard of as far as discussions in the workplace or any form of enforcement. Back then, everybody's focus was reducing accidents, predominantly fatal accidents, and then they got heavily into machine guarding and the likes. But they've policed that so heavily over the last several decades that occupational disease now surpasses occupational accidents as the leading cause of fatalities in Canadian workplaces. And so now we're suddenly seeing a much stronger focus on occupational disease prevention than we've ever seen before in workplaces. In 2017, workplace safety and health combined with Safe Work Manitoba came out with the Occupational Disease and Illness Prevention Strategy. This put a focus on trying to reduce the numbers of occupational diseases in the workplaces in Manitoba. So from there, we look at regulations in Manitoba. So from a workplace safety and health standpoint, we have the Workplace Safety and Health Act W210, and under that is the Workplace Safety and Health Regulation MR2 217-2006. And so when we look at occupational disease prevention in the workplace, we're going to be focusing on parts 2, 6, 33, 35, 36, and 37 of the regulation. Part 37 of the regulation is the asbestos regulation, and that's where a lot of the focus and attention goes when we start talking about occupational disease prevention in the workplace, because that's very specific to asbestos, and there's some very specific requirements under that regulation. But then we have Part 36 of the regulation as well, which is chemical biological substances, and that section regulates all of the other hazardous materials that we're going to find in a workplace. And so this is where we fall short in a lot of the workplaces, because under Part 36 of the regulation, anywhere there's a potential exposure to a hazardous substance in a workplace, you have to do a risk assessment, develop safe work procedures. There's requirements for engineering controls and exposure monitoring. And that's because they don't specifically spell out individual hazardous materials in 36 like they do in Part 37. We see that a lot of the other hazardous substances kind of fall through the cracks, and people don't, it's one of those things, we don't know about them, so we don't know to look for them kind of attitude. And so we find that a lot of the things that need to be addressed as risk assessments kind of get overlooked in a lot of workplaces. When we're looking at work, renovation and construction work, then we've got to look at also parts 33 and 35 of the regulation. Part 33 of the regulation is the demolition section of the regulation. And there's a section in there that says prior to any renovation or demolition work in a building, you have to remove all of the hazardous materials. And if you can't remove them, you have to remove them in compliance with parts 36 and 37 of the regulation. Without doing a hazardous materials assessment, you don't know what hazardous substances you've got in a building. And so that's where we get into a catch-22 as far as, what do we have to do prior to any renovation and demolition work. Part 35 is the WMIS section. And so what workplace safety and health tells us is if you're doing renovation and demolition work where you're removing hazardous substances, you're going to have fugitive emissions. So Part 35 WMIS is going to apply to hazardous materials removal as well. And then we've got Part 6 of the regulation, which is your personal protective equipment. And that talks about all of the personal protective equipment, including respiratory protection that you would need when dealing with these substances. And then Part 2 is the general duty clause. So anything that's not captured under all those other sections when we talk about hazardous materials gets captured under Part 2 of the regulation. In addition, we've got the Transportation of Dangerous Goods Handling and Transportation Act, which covers off the transportation from the workplace to the landfill or wherever it has to go for disposal. We have a hazardous waste regulation, which is going to govern our landfills. And then we have a couple of guidelines that apply to the hazardous materials as well. We've got the Guide for Asbestos Management, which is the guidance document, which is going to help us understand the asbestos portion of the regulations. And then the new guideline that came out recently is the guideline managing demolition debris containing hazardous materials. And that guideline actually specifically provides a list of numerous hazardous materials that need to be addressed as part of a pre-renovation or pre-demolition assessment prior to any demolition work that goes on in a building. And so those materials would include such things as lead, PCBs, arsenic, those sort of things. So,
Edwin,
yes,
interrupting. We're noticing a bit of a delay or in the PowerPoint screen sharing. It appears on our screen that your the actual slide is kind of frozen without seeing all of the details. I'm just wondering if you can either advance the slide forward to see if that's going to make it clearer from our perspective.
Which slide are you looking at?
It says regulations right now, and right now it looks like it's clear. Before it looked like there was one screen overlapping the other, but right now it's fine on regulations. Can you
Okay.
advance one more just to make sure that that's fine? Yeah, on this screen, it looks like regulations is fine, but underneath it, it almost looks like there's a grayish, and that's fine there. Whatever you did, if there was anything different that you did now, that screen is clear.
I moved my mouse.
You moved your mouse. Okay. So this screen is clear. The one just before that seemed blurry with a bit of a, almost like a watermark color underneath it. So
It must have been my mouse.
okay, all good. I think we're good now. So sorry for interrupting. I just wanted to make sure that.
No, it's all good. So,
Okay.
so under the regulations, under parts 36 and parts 37 of the regulation, in order to comply with the requirement to protect worker safety and health, there's the need to assess risks to workers, establish safe work procedures, conduct exposure monitoring, where there may be an overexposure to a worker in the workplace. There's a requirement to implement effective control measures to protect those workers. And then there's the requirement to conduct additional exposure monitoring to ensure that the control measures are working effectively. Now, this is where things get a little bit fuzzy for a lot of employers because it doesn't tell you how to go about doing this, and it doesn't talk specifically to the details of, what do we have to monitor for, or how do we have to, or how frequently we have to do that. So this is where you end up with the requirement, the need to bring in a competent person that understands it in those situations. So hazardous materials under parts 36 and 37 must be identified prior to renovations or demolition work, which means you need to have some sort of assessment done, which typically involves a written report afterwards. And then, as mentioned previously, all the hazardous materials must be removed in a safe manner and disposed of. And this is covered under parts 33, 36, and 37 of the regulation, as well as the hazardous waste regulation, which is where we need to bring in qualified contractors and workers, as well as competent consultants to develop and establish what the requirements are. So we get into project design. What we want to try to avoid when we're doing renovation and demolition work is starting the work and then going, oh, is this a hazardous material? Or discovering hazardous materials after we've started selective demolition. So what we want to do is as part of the design, we want to review the scope of our renovation before the actual renovation works starts. And this allows for the development of budgets, proper scope of work specifications, and more cost-effective tendering with more valid pricing. If you wait until after the job is tendered, then all the pricing everything is up in the air. It's surprises. The pricing is more expensive. Trying to get competent contractors to actually do the abatement tends to be a bit of a challenge sometimes. So getting all your T's crossed and your I's dotted ahead of time is a huge part of this. And this is where it becomes important to educate the clients and the architects and the engineers ahead of time, going, hey, as part of the planning stages, you should be addressing these things. So many times we get calls where we get they're in the middle of a walkthrough and the architect or the engineer is calling, going, oh, we had the walkthrough and the contractor started asking about all these about asbestos on the work site or on the project. Can you do an asbestos assessment after the tender's already started? And then all of a sudden the cost of doing the assessment goes up because everything is rushed and they want to get everything done before the tender closes. If we look at the guide for asbestos management, they actually spell out in the guideline there that the pre-renovation assessment that an inventory should be provided to the contractors at the tender stage, not wait until after the contract is awarded. So clearly catching these materials at the design stage is really going to make your life easier from a contractor's standpoint when we're looking at this work. And then once the work starts, MR2 17/2006, Part 37 says that prior to any work that could release asbestos in the atmosphere, you have to actually notify the Department of Workplace Safety and Health at least 5 days before the abatement starts. And this is probably where some of you as contractors might be all of a sudden getting questions from Workplace Safety and Health going, was there a pre-renovation assessment done on this job? Because what's happening is when contractors are pulling building permits for jobs, Workplace Safety and Health is being notified of these projects, and they're starting to follow up to find out whether or not these pre-renovation inventories have been done. So this is probably where some of these questions are coming up going, whose responsibility is it to have an inventory done, and what needs to be included in it? Because all of a sudden contractors are being awarded jobs, and then Workplace is asking them, well, was there an assessment done? So Workplace is catching a lot of this through the demolition permits that are being pulled, but also when abatement contractors are putting in their 5 days notice prior to starting any projects. There's the requirement to remove the hazardous materials in a safe manner, as well as to develop safe work practices for handling the asbestos, which means you have to have safe work procedures on site and developed for this work. Validation, you want to monitor the work to make sure it's being done in compliance with the procedures. This involves verifying the scope of work. It may involve air monitoring to make sure that the work is being done safely, and then verifying waste handling. So, some of the concerns we've heard raised were there was a couple of projects where a demolition contractor was actually got caught hauling hazardous waste out of town and dumping it in a farmer's field instead of hauling it to landfill to be disposed of properly. So, tracking the waste, making sure it's actually going where it's supposed to is an important part of this as well. So this is where, having inspection reports done during the abatement, documenting waste with waste manifests to actually show where it's going out, and even having a closure report at the end of the job that summarizes that everything was done correctly can save you a lot of grief. So when we talk about abatement on renovation projects and some of the things that you need to be concerned of, asbestos is the big one, because Part 37 of the regulation specifically spells out asbestos and that you have to have an inventory done. They talk, but when it comes to the other hazardous materials that we're going to encounter in a workplace, it's going to be lead, whether it's paints, primers, in the bell and spigot joints, you've got the lead gaskets where it's poured in there as sealants, lead acid batteries and emergency lights. These are all things that we would be looking for. Silica, it's in so many different products. Silica is the most abundant mineral on the Earth's surface. So we find it anywhere there's sand, gravel, concrete. It's in drywall, it's in plaster, it's in acoustic ceiling tiles. We encounter silica in so many different products. So that's another thing that we need safe work procedures for. And, it's one of those products that gets disturbed on a lot of construction projects. And there isn't a lot of monitoring that's being done with the silica. So there's a lot of exposures that go on with silica that slide under the radar. Mercury, it's found in fluorescent light tubes and in thermostats in buildings. So we want to identify those before any demolition occurs. PCBs, those ones, everybody thinks of light ballasts when we think of PCBs. But they added it to caulkings and they added it to expansion joints in buildings to improve the pliability in them. So the old caulkings on the exterior of buildings, the softer and the more pliable they are, the greater the likelihood that they contain PCBs. And they can have some very, very high concentrations of PCBs in the caulkings and the expansion joints. They were added to these materials to improve their pliability in cold weather. And when we've got them in old buildings, we've had situations where the actual PCBs have leached out of the caulkings and the expansion joints into adjoining construction materials. So these are items that can have some very large cost impacts on a project if they're discovered after the fact. And then, of course, mold can be found in everything from the oldest buildings right through to some of the newest construction, because anywhere you've got moisture, there's going to be potential mold concerns. So when we talk about asbestos, some of the more common materials we're going to encounter in buildings are going to be fireproofings, floor tiles, ceiling tiles, sheet flooring, texture coats, mechanical insulations. Vermiculite is a huge one. Vermiculite, we're finding it, everybody thinks about residential attics, but hollow core concrete block walls are a common place where we find concealed vermiculite. And vermiculite can generate some very high exposures when disturbed in an uncontrolled manner. So it's something that we have to be very, very aware of when we encounter it in buildings. Drywall joint compound, plasters, asbestos cement pipes, siding, and those sort of materials. In addition, mastics, glues, caulkings, and adhesives are all going to be suspect. Stucco finishes on the exterior of buildings, brakes and clutches, gaskets, ceiling tiles are all sources of asbestos that we find in the buildings. And you have to be careful because the guidelines say that at minimum you have to do an asbestos inventory for any building built before 1990, but the regulation actually states any building that may have asbestos in it needs to have an inventory done. So from a management standpoint, we've seen some fairly significant enforcement on the older buildings constructed before 1990, but from a pre-renovation standpoint, the federal government did not ban the import and the use of asbestos in buildings until January 1st of 2019. So any building built right up until 2019 could legally have asbestos containing materials in them. Lead was added to paint for durability, and it adds pigment. Exposure to lead can affect the brain development and damage to primary organs. Activities that can cause exposure include building demolition, sanding, grinding, torching of steel, welding, and abrasive blasting. And it's in a lot of different coatings. When we look at lead in paints and coatings, this is another material that is misunderstood because it is still legal to have lead in industrial coatings in certain applications. So we find primers on structural steel, we find coatings on industrial buildings that still have some fairly significant levels of lead in them, even in newer coatings. So something that people are not necessarily always aware of. Mercury was found in control switches, thermostats, pressure devices such as manometers, thermometers, fluorescent light tubes. The challenge is liquid mercury is very difficult to clean up and it's very volatile. The mercury fumes are readily created under normal temperatures, which means that when they are disturbed in a building, it's hard to clean them up. They vaporize really easily, so the potential for exposure can occur quite quickly. PCBs were used in capacitors and light ballasts as fluids and transformers. We find it in hydraulic fluids. It was used in lubricants and caulkings. It was non-conductive. It transferred heat well, and it was a good plasticizer. So as I mentioned earlier, it made for pliable caulkings and adhesives. And then some of the other materials that we're going to find. Silica. There's not a construction site anywhere in this country where you're not going to encounter silica dust. And I mean, silica was a big one. There was a fairly significant project that was in the news last week where there was issues with silica on a media blasting project. Mold can be found in some of the newer buildings, right up to the older buildings. Anytime you have a water loss or any time building materials get wet, there's going to be mold issues or potential mold issues. Droppings, this is another one. We get into derelict buildings, you're going to have pigeons and bats and rodents in there, but even newer buildings right now, fall is coming. I live in a rural area, so I've noticed this year there was a lot more mice in our community than we've seen in past years. And so with the colder weather coming, they're going to be looking for warm places to go. So all a mouse needs is an opening the size of a pencil eraser to get in, to push through. And so it doesn't take long to end up with rodents in buildings, and the deer mice carry hantavirus. So, and they like to go, the deer mice like the elevated areas. So when you start popping ceiling tiles, if you start seeing mouse droppings and stuff on top of the ceiling tile, that's a potential concern. People can get sick quite easily. And if you develop flu-like symptoms within a couple of weeks, with a week to 9 days of disturbing mouse, rodent droppings, you should bring it to your doctor's attention, because it could potentially be hantavirus. Oftentimes the symptoms are very similar to a cold or a flu, and people don't always realize it. People get sick and they just assume that their exposure is from something, a virus or a bug they picked up, but oftentimes it's environmental and we don't realize it, because a lot of the times symptoms from different illnesses have overlapping symptoms, and it becomes very difficult to diagnose for doctors. So we do need to be aware of what's in our surroundings, because if you don't bring things to the doctor's attention, they don't always know to look for it. So again, animal droppings is something to be very aware of. But in addition, chemicals, whether they're chemicals that are used as part of the construction renovation process, or just stuff that's stored in the building. We get into working in universities and schools and laboratories, and oftentimes there's chemicals being used in these buildings. Or we go into industrial facilities, and there's chemicals that are being used in those buildings. It's very important to be aware of them. And we don't always think about it. A number of years ago, there was a case where they were doing some duct cleaning in a building where they were doing automotive painting, and they didn't have explosion-proof lights, and there was a pocket of fumes in the duct, and the worker was severely burned because of a fire that caused because of fumes that were in a fume hood that nobody was anticipating. Those are the sort of things that we have to pay attention to, and this is why it's so important to have risk assessments done when we're looking at buildings and doing work in renovation projects. And as contractors, you're not always going to be familiar with the hazards in the building where you're going. So it's important to ask the client, questions about potential hazards that could be in a building that you are unaware of. So it's important to understand the health effects of the different types of exposures. Asbestos, the primary route is going to be inhalation. That's the way asbestos enters the body. There are ties to ingestion, and asbestos warts, but those are not common. Predominantly respiratory illness is what we're going to be concerned about. And the time from exposure to the onset of disease is anywhere from 15 to 50 years after you've been exposed. So, people disturb materials and they don't pay attention to it and they don't give it much heed because occupational disease doesn't affect us right now. And so this is why we've historically seen a lot of non-compliance, because you don't see the symptoms right away. Asbestos exposure should be kept to a minimum. Asbestos is present in our natural environment. It's important to understand we inhale between 1,000 and 2,000 asbestos fibers daily just because of what's naturally occurring in our environment. That sounds like a large number, but it really isn't. But everybody's been exposed to some level of asbestos just because of what's naturally in our environment. And as long as your exposures stay within what's naturally occurring in the environment, there's no notable risk of the onset of asbestos in somebody. But when we start getting into uncontrolled disturbance of asbestos, the exposures are hundreds of thousands of times higher than what's in the outdoor environment. And that's where the concerns occur and where the issues arise. Asbestos is the leading killer in the Canadian workplace, bar none. And it is definitely the most underreported one. Lead exposures, they can have negative effects on various body systems. They affect the nervous system. They can cause permanent nerve damage, tremors, irritability, depression, and even death. It can affect your bone marrow and your circulatory system, causes anemia and high blood pressure. It affects your kidneys. It can cause kidney damage and kidney failure, and causes issues with both male and female reproductive health, resulting in things like infertility, spontaneous abortions, birth defects, and sexual dysfunction. When you become exposed to lead in the workplace, the lead circulates in your bloodstream for approximately a month. In that time frame, a certain percentage is going to deposit into your bone marrow. A certain percentage is going to get deposited in your soft tissue, your liver, your kidneys, the different organs, and they will house that lead the bone marrow can house lead for over 30 years. Your organs can hold on to the lead for about a month. And then after that, your kidneys filter the lead out of your bloodstream and you urinate it out of your body.
Edwin, I'm just going to
Yes.
pause you right there. Your screen again is kind of locked up. So if you can just move excellent. Thank you.
So those are some of the concerns that we see with lead exposure. Lead exposure can be chronic and it can be acute. So depending on the level of exposure in the workplace, it can affect you. If you have a high level of exposure, it can hospitalize you very, very easily in a short period of time, but you can have long-term low level of exposures that can affect your health as well. Mercury, it evaporates at room temperature and the exposure limit is extremely low with it. Even small scale spills can lead to significant vapor levels that can be hazardous on a chronic exposure basis. Chronic exposures can result in neurological effects, tremors in hands, arms, legs, stomach aches, etc. At high concentrations, symptoms include shortness of breath, tightness in the chest, coughing, fevers, and sweating. Silica exposure is very, very similar to asbestos in that it causes scarring of the lung tissues. It is linked to lung cancer. And it can cause chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which includes chronic bronchitis and emphysema. So these are examples of some of the health issues that can be tied to hazardous materials and why it's so important to address them in the workplace. For assessments, it's important to understand there's different types of assessments that are out there. There is management assessments that are meant for the day-to-day management of a building. And then there's going to be pre-renovation assessments that need to be done for a building. So one of the things we've seen historically in the past is clients will have an inventory done for asbestos of their building. It's a management survey. They may not have it updated on an annual basis. And sometimes they'll give that to an architect or an engineer, and it gets attached to the back of a set of tender documents. And, they'll have detailed drawings and specs for a renovation job. And then when it comes to the hazardous materials, it says asbestos is present in the building. See the attached inventory. Remove all asbestos in compliance with the regulations and guidelines. That does not comply with the regulatory requirements for dealing with asbestos in the workplace. A management survey is only going to address the things that impact the day-to-day operations of a building. It's not going to be looking for concealed materials hidden in concrete block walls or above solid ceilings or in bulkheads and pipe chases necessarily. And so when we get into renovation work and demolition work, now all of a sudden you're doing selective demolition and you're opening up all these cavities that were not looked at as part of a management survey. And then on top of that, the regulation states that if you have asbestos in your building, the inventory has to be updated on an annual basis. If you get a 4 or 5 year old document handed to you and go, here's the inventory for the building, and it's more than a year old, it's not compliant with the regulations. So it's really important to understand there's a distinct difference between a management survey and a pre-renovation assessment or a pre-renovation report. So we talk about naming conventions. They vary across the industry. You're going to have people talk about hazardous materials assessments, pre-construction assessments, designated substance assessments. These are ones that are looking for multiple hazardous materials, not typically just asbestos. We talk about management level assessments, as I mentioned. They're used for long-term management of materials, which is going to be predominantly asbestos. Some clients will have full hazmat surveys for a management standpoint, but it's not common. From the day-to-day management of a building, it's the asbestos that comes up in the regulations as being a specific requirement. So that's the one we see most frequently. It's typically going to have many exclusions for materials that are covered in the scope of work. It's not adequate for planning renovations, demolition, or other major work. And all accessible interior areas are going to be assessed with limited review of the exterior of the building. Because, we don't want to be damaging things like building envelope seals, roofing membranes as part of a management survey, because they could lead to mold issues and other problems in the building. But prior to renovation or demolition, you need to have pre-construction assessments done. They're going to be project specific. They're going to be dealing specifically with the scope that is dependent on the renovation work that is being completed. They're only going to impact areas. Only the areas impacted by the renovation work are generally going to be assessed. And the exclusions on them are going to be very, very minor. We're going to be trying to avoid having stuff listed as, oh, we didn't look for this, and that. Because we don't want surprises once the renovation works, starts. When we prepare reports, our reports are going to have an executive summary, which is a quick snapshot of the hazardous materials that are present. And we find that a lot of people never look past the executive summary. But there's usually lots of information that can be found in the body of the report. The body of the report is going to give you more specific information on the hazardous materials, including the quantities and condition that you're going to find. And then the recommendations are going to show what needs to be done from a management standpoint, because when we go through a building, there's going to be damage. We may encounter damaged materials that are going to need to be dealt with, whether they're part of the scope of the renovation or not. And then it's going to have specific recommendations that are going to be tied to the materials that are going to be impacted by the renovation or demolition work. Drawings do not always show all of the hazardous materials. So it's important to look at, all the other data that's included in the report as well. So all parts of the report need to be read, not just the executive summary and the drawings when you're looking at a pre-renovation report. The pre-construction and pre-demolition assessments are very important, because in order to comply with the requirements of the regulation, they need to be included in the tender packages for pricing the work. They need to ensure that relevant hazardous materials are identified and are going to be properly removed as part of the planned work. And the main goal is to protect not just the public, but the renovation workers from exposures during the work. Occupational disease, the numbers are, really high. We're seeing a lot of people impacted annually. Historically, Manitoba sees 10 accepted claims a year for asbestos fatalities. A third of the fatalities accepted claims by Workers' Compensation Board in Manitoba annually are asbestos-related fatalities, and that's not including silica and other occupational disease exposures. So it's really important that these things get clearly identified up front as part of the renovation work, so that we can make sure that we develop proper scope of work, proper safe work procedures to ensure that the work gets done safely. For pre-construction, demolition versus management, from a pre-construction, pre-demolition assessment, following materials may be investigated for and sampled depending on the scope of work. And it's unlikely that you're going to find these in management grade surveys. Roofing materials. There's roofing felts, tars, asphalt coatings, sealants on roofs can have, hazardous materials in them. We're finding asbestos, lead and PCBs on roofs. And one of the things we hear is, oh, well, the roof was replaced in 2004, so we don't have to worry about it. But if you actually think about it, if they replaced the roof in 2004 and they stripped it right down to the concrete deck, did they scrape every last bit of tar off the deck below all the roofing felts? Not typically. And so what we're finding is a lot of newer roofs that have a layer of asbestos containing tar on the deck itself that wasn't removed as part of the roof replacement. So when we get into, coring holes through roofs or doing roof work, there's tar coatings on roofs that get missed because they did a roof replacement. Nobody thought to look under, to look to see what was underneath it. Vermiculite, that's another common thing that we look for. It's going to be often found in hollow core concrete walls. Asbestos containing vermiculite came from W.R. Grace. Their mine was in Libby, Montana. They shut their mine down in 1990 due to asbestos concerns. They processed the vermiculite that came out of that mine for 2 years after they shut it down. So they were processing it right up until 1992. And they were shipping it by rail to Winnipeg to be processed on Pacific Avenue, where they had a processing facility. So well over 95% of the vermiculite that was sold in Manitoba right into the mid to late 90s is going to be suspect to contain asbestos. Paper products, under flooring, in roofs and walls are all going to be suspect in the older buildings. We're going to find materials in pipe chases or solid wall column enclosures, caulkings, exterior cladding, etc. So these are all things that need to be looked at as part of pre-renovation assessments. And that's why it's really important to understand the scope of a renovation during the design phase, so that we know what to look for as part of a pre-renovation or a pre-demolition assessment. So, now that you know what needs to be looked for and why, the 6 steps for project success are going to be advanced planning, which includes accurate details on the scope of work. It's really important to know what the scope of work is so that we know what to test for. Conducting detailed risk assessments and developing safe work procedures. Conducting exposure monitoring if it's determined necessary by the risk assessment. It's very hard to do hazardous materials work without, materials becoming airborne. So understanding, whether or not the engineering controls are working properly and that the personal protective equipment is right for the level of exposure that's occurring. Developing the safe work procedures before the work occurs. Implementing engineering controls. Using proper personal protective equipment. Making sure the procedures are actually followed and that the equipment gets used. The regulation says not only do you have to develop safe work procedures, you have to implement them. And under Part 2 of the regulation, it's the employer's responsibility to make sure that the workers follow the safe work procedures that are followed for them. And then, as necessary, you're going to conduct additional exposure monitoring to verify that the procedures and the engineering controls are working effectively. And so that's it for the presentation. I thank you for your time. And if you have questions now, I'm more than happy to answer anything that you have.
Thank you, Edwin. I think the chat box is open and I already can see a couple questions coming in there. Do you see those questions, Edwin?
I'm trying to open the chat now.
The question here, while you're opening it up, is can you review again the dates of when asbestos-lead mercury PCBs stopped being used in construction?
No, there are no specific dates. Asbestos, they never stopped using asbestos because of concerns for health and safety. Asbestos containing materials were phased out based on lawsuits. Friable materials were outlawed in Manitoba February 1st, 2007, years after they stopped being manufactured and used. The federal government did not ban the import of asbestos containing materials into Canada until January 1st of 2019. We don't know if anybody's actually checking at the border to see if they're actually complying with the import ban. Prior to the ban on importing asbestos into Canada, the manufacturing regulation said if it was a non-friable material that was being manufactured for the purpose of going into another manufactured piece of equipment, they had no legal requirement to disclose asbestos in those products. So gaskets, clutch plates, automotive brakes, butyl seals in windows, those sort of materials were being imported into Canada, and they weren't legally required to tell anyone there was asbestos in those products. So as of January 1st, 2019, it was illegal to bring them into Canada, but if nobody was disclosing there was asbestos in them before then, have they stopped importing them into Canada, we don't know. Lead was phased out over a period of years. You know, when it comes to industrial coatings, lead can be found in a wide variety of different materials. They're still making lead acid batteries. They're still putting lead in some of the industrial coatings, any wear resistant paints. So things like floor paints, you know, you go into a warehouse and you see yellow lines painted on the floor. They may have been applied 2 years ago and still have some significant amounts of lead in them simply because it was added for wear resistance. Primers, corrosion resistant primers on structural steel can still have lead in it, right up until today, as well as other different types of heavy metals. So architectural finishes, they faded or phased out, you know, in the 70s and 80s. They phased out a lot of the lead in some of the architectural finishes. But once we get into, you know, the industrial coatings, it's in all kinds of different materials. Silica, it's in brand new construction materials. Silica's in anything that has sand or rock in it in any form or another. So there's a lot of different materials that have it. PCBs were banned in the late 70s. So early to mid 80s, their PCBs should have been no longer in use.
Thank you, Edwin. Another question came in. You mentioned about filing a notice of asbestos work prior to any asbestos abatement being carried out. If it is a type 1 asbestos abatement and no consultant is required for this work scope, is it still necessary to file a notice to the province?
Okay, so what the regulation states is the notice has to be issued prior to any renovation, alteration, or demolition that could release asbestos into the atmosphere. The guide for asbestos management defines that specifically as type 2 and type 3 abatement. So, but the guideline is a guidance document. It is a measure of best practice. It is not a regulation. So I have seen a stop work order slapped on a job where failure to provide notice was included on the stop work order once. And the regulator that wrote the stop work order said that, as the regulation says, any work that has the potential to release asbestos into the atmosphere. So his interpretation was, as soon as the demolition fence went up around the structure, the demolition had started and a 5-day notice should have been provided to the province. That is not what is being actively enforced, but that was one officer's interpretation of the regulation. What Workplace has told us in the past is they're requiring it for type 2 and type 3 work. They are not actively enforcing it for type 1 work, but they would appreciate it if you sent it in for type 1 work as well.
Thank you, Edwin. We do have a few more minutes, so if you haven't already put your question into the chat, feel free to do that. I do have a few other items I wanted to take note of, so I'll review this information, and then if there's other questions, feel free to put those into the chat. So thank you, Edwin, for your presentation, and for all of you who have attended today. Please visit the Construction Safety Association of Manitoba's YouTube channel to view Edwin's presentation. We have recorded this session and it will be made available on the YouTube channel shortly after today's presentation. We also have Edwin's PowerPoint slides and can send that out as well to you. Something that I would like to also bring your attention to is that we do have an asbestos awareness course coming up on October 26th. So if this presentation today has piqued your interest to learn more about asbestos, please look to register for the October 26th Asbestos Awareness course here at the Construction Safety Association of Manitoba. You can visit our website at www.constructionsafety.ca. And without further ado, because I'm not seeing any further questions, we would
There was one more.
Oh, there was one more. What is the differences with the types of abatement?
Okay, so when we look at the guide for asbestos management, they break down asbestos abatement into type 1 low risk work, which is only non-friable materials, and a non-friable material. So the regulation defines an asbestos containing material as friable or non-friable, and a non-friable material is anything that is not easily crushed, pulverized, or rendered to dust with moderate hand pressure. A friable material is something that's easily reduced to dust with moderate hand pressure when the product is dry. Because it's respiratory disease, there's more hazard associated with friable materials. So low risk is non-friable materials only. Moderate risk is the minor removal of friable materials. And then type 3 high risk is major disturbance of friable materials. And so the level of personal protective equipment, decontamination facilities, site isolation changes based on the level of risk. When we get into mold abatement, they break it down into level 1, level 2, and level 3 abatement, which very closely mirrors the asbestos procedures. When we start talking about lead, PCBs, mercury, we don't have specific guidelines in Manitoba that are tied to these hazardous materials. So we do what we do is we adopt similar procedures based on potential risks. And so if you look at the Environmental Abatement Council of Canada, which was formerly ECO out of Ontario, they have developed a very detailed lead guideline on how to deal with lead, and they break it down into type 1, type 2, and type 3 procedures as well. So we see a lot of overlap in the different procedures from one type of material to the next based on potential exposure concerns.
Excellent. Thank you, Edwin. And I do believe I'm not seeing any further questions, but we do want to get your feedback on today's session. So on your screen, you'll see a QR code there. Please take some time to scan that. That'll take you to an evaluation of today's session so that you can complete that and let us know your thoughts on today's session. Your feedback is very welcomed, and we are planning to continue these webinars, lunch and learns, going forward. So watch this space because we will be planning the next one probably by end of October, early November. So please make note to attend when you do find out more information on these events going forward and into 2024 and the conference coming up on February 13th and 14th of next year. So thanks again, everyone. We will see you later, and thanks for attending, and thank you, Edwin.
Thank you.